guys, this is Miss Sinclair from AP World History Modern at University High School. I am here to continue our Unit 7 lectures. We are going to be finishing up World War I today and talking about the home front and the Spanish flu. So our objective for today is you'll be able to identify and explain the Russian Revolution because we're getting to that too. So our AP topics are 7.4 and 7.5, the interwar period. But let's pick up with the American involvement. So we've talked about how the war was done primarily. We've talked about the chaos and drudgery that is trench warfare on the Western Front. We talked about the disaster that is Russian war efforts, how their soldiers didn't have food, their soldiers didn't have weapons, their soldiers were sent to die, and it will lead to a revolution in which Russia will back out of the war, leaving the Germans to only focus on the Western Front instead of an Eastern Front as well. So, what about the Americans? Well, the Americans have been involved since the beginning. Even though we were technically neutral, we were involved. We were selling food and weapons. We gave loans to the Allies, the Entente. We first got involved again in 1915 when the German submarine sank the British liner, the Lusitania, and over 100 Americans died. The Germans claimed that the Lusitania carried secret shipments of weapons. The British denied it. It was later proven true. And in 1916, Germany attacked more U.S. merchant ships en route to Britain. So, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare. The U.S. is getting more and more interested in war, but it's hard to get involved. I mean, it's kind of a dumb war. We've established that the motivations for it aren't great. And then how do you sell this to the American public? What I want to do is I want to send your sons to Europe to die because a bunch of European dudes decided to fight each other. It's a hard sell. So in 1917, you have the tipping point, the Zimmermann telegram. So the Zimmermann telegram is a telegram from Germany to Mexico in which Germany promises Mexico territory that it had lost in the Mexican-American War if Mexico joined Germany in the war and attacked the United States. Now, Mexico is like, I never got this telegram. Germany's like, I never sent this telegram. Britain was the one who supposedly intercepted it and gave it to the Americans. The validity of it is questionable. More than one historian has argued that this telegram was really a forgery on the part of the British to try and get the Americans' involvement. And the Americans didn't really push back. The American government kind of wanted a reason to get involved, and so this gave them sort of that diplomatic cover. So, in 1917, the United States enters World War I. The policy previously was isolationism. Now, millions of American men are in training. And to this end, Germany thinks, okay, we need to end the war now, right? It's going to be the American involvement that ends the war in favor of the Allies. The arrival of millions, thousands of fresh troops who aren't bogged down by 4 years of fighting in the trenches, who aren't demoralized, who are eager to fight. It's going to be enough. So, I want you to do a quick bit of review. What problems did the Schieffelin Plan try and solve? And how were non-Western regions involved in the war effort? Cite an example. All right, let's talk a little bit about the home front and the war economy. So first off, you need to know rationing. Soldiers needed the best of everything: weapons, ammunition, food. That meant civilians at home had to go without. So civilians worked harder, they ate less, and they paid high taxes. But most of them were willing to do this at first. They were happy to support the war effort, happy to support their families, their sons. So During this time, the government had really strict controls over the economy, right? Laissez-faire goes out the window in a time of war. So food rations were distributed to people by need, which meant poor people actually got better nutrition during war than they would have otherwise, right? It was no longer anyone could buy as much food as they wanted based off their wealth. The government controlled how much everyone got, and they needed everyone able to work and fight. So this was a good time for the poor. Unemployment disappeared, right? Everyone's working. Thousands of Africans, Indians, and Chinese were recruited to work in Europe. So you have migration of these people coming to England to work in factories as these men who had previously owned those jobs were sent off to the war. Women entered the workforce as well, leaving the home to work in jobs vacated by men in government and even in the war as ambulance drivers, nurses, and mechanics. Women are going to have a sense of participation in the war effort and a taste of personal and economic freedom, and this feeling isn't going to go away after the war. German civilians, though, are really going to suffer the most out of all civilian groups in Europe. All overseas trade was stopped because of the naval blockade of the British. And so they starved. The German civilians just starved during the war. They first had bread from flour, and then they would eat rye, and then potatoes and turnips, then acorns and chestnuts, right? At this point, you are eating the things that the squirrels eat, right? Because there's no actual food, so you're just gathering things off the trees, off the ground. And finally, some German civilians were eating sawdust, right? They're starving to death. People had to survive on 1,000 calories a day, and you need about 2,000 calories, especially if you're working in manual labor. Women, children, and the elderly are hit especially hard. Because, of course, the food is going first to the soldiers, second to the factory workers. So if you are old, if you are not working, if you're a child, you're not getting food. So German soldiers would actually raid enemy lines to try and get food. And while all this is happening, you're having the Spanish flu pandemic. This is a fascinating part of world history, which I don't think gets enough attention. And of course, I will not be able to do it justice. I do have a couple book recommendations. One is The Great Influenza, and the other is The Pale Rider. The Pale Rider is really good for an overview of the Spanish flu, especially from a global view. So, the Spanish flu pandemic, it has nothing to do with Spain, but it did probably get its start in the hospitals of the war. Diseases got spread, people got moved around. There's no one spot where we know it started. There's essentially 3 spots proposed. One is an American army camp, one is a hospital in France, and the other's like in China. We don't know. We do know, however, that as people from Asia moved to the Americas, moved to Europe as workers, as soldiers left their isolated farms and went to cities and then went across the ocean, across boundaries, they brought the disease with them. So the Spanish flu will hit in essentially 3 big waves. And it is not going to be well publicized. We will see that the media is highly censored during this time. The government doesn't want more bad news, and so it's not really talked about. And as a result, you don't have good information. But 5% of the world's total population dies. It's 33 million people. And entire isolated communities of indigenous peoples in Alaska are going to die. You're going to see that the government of Rio de Janeiro is completely destabilized. One of the things about Spanish flu was that it got the strong sick, right? Usually illnesses kill the elderly and the young, right? The most vulnerable in our population. But Spanish flu would take out the young and the strong. And so when you add this to the death toll that is World War I, just these 4 years are just such a loss of human life. There's a great video from the CDC about the Spanish flu. It's one of our big pandemics. Definitely interesting topic to learn about, especially considering now in March of 2020, the coronavirus is a big concern of many people. A lot of the policies in place that will be used in response to any modern day pandemics are actually established during the 1918 flu epidemic. This is one of many videos that are on our YouTube playlist. You can see them all in a just World War I playlist or just in our general Unit 7 playlist. But let's talk a little bit about women in World War I. Or actually, I already did. So these are pictures. You can see women working in factories, women building gas masks, women working as ambulance drivers, as newspaper deliverers, as secretaries, as chemists, right? That's Madame Curie. So women were involved in a war effort as well, just like non-Europeans were. That's the kind of thing the AP likes to ask about. All right, let's talk about the Ottomans. So the Ottomans signed a secret alliance with Germany, hoping to gain land at Russia's expense. What we're going to see come out of the Ottoman involvement in World War I is, first and foremost, the Armenian Genocide. So the Armenian Genocide was basically the first formally recognized genocide, although it's highly debated today. It is, like, if you were to talk to someone in Turkey about it, it would be a highly contentious issue. But we've talked before about how under Sultan Hamid II, the Armenians were really targeted. The Armenians were seen as pro-Russian since they were Christian. So they will be forced to march across the mountains in winter. That hundreds of thousands will die from exposure, from hunger, and just straight up murder. Then you have the Gallipoli campaign. The Gallipoli campaign is a Greek peninsula that the British will fight to keep. And it's going to be a disaster. Lots of British will die. And we see that the Ottomans keep it. But the Ottomans have a concern to the south. So the British send in men like Lawrence of Arabia, right, like the movie, to go into the Arabian Peninsula and cut deals with all of the Arab princes there, saying, hey, if you fight against the Ottomans, if you revolt, if you can distract the Ottomans, then you can govern yourself once this war is over. So Prince Faisal is one to know. He is going to be in what sort of modern day Iraq. You have also, though, the Zionist movement. So Theodor Herzl is an Austrian journalist, and the Zionist movement is a belief that the Jews need a national homeland, right? World War I is all about nationalism. People are feeling the need that, like, my ethnicity needs to have territory dedicated to it so we can govern ourselves. So in Europe, we have this crazy anti-Semitism, right? You have the Dreyfus Affair in France. You have the pogroms in Russia. Its anti-Semitism is at an all-time high. So Zionism seems like the best response to anti-Semitism. Look, if you hate us, we'll get out of town and we'll set up our own home. So the Balfour Declaration is a statement issued by Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour in 1917, favoring the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The problem is that they also promised this land to Faisal and a few other people as well. This is a highly contentious issue, the issue of Israel and Palestine, and it is one that has not been settled. It is one where you will find people with very strong opinions on. I am not interested in debating that topic in this world history podcast, but there are definite arguments in favor of Israel as a state and viewing the Holocaust, you can't argue that it was a necessity. On the other hand, some people argue that this is another example of European imperialism, right? Theodor Herzl is an Austrian guy, and he's essentially saying, look, we should take this land that's already occupied by non-Europeans and just occupy it and live it just like we do in Australia, just like we do in Argentina and in New Zealand and in Canada and the United States, right? Let's ignore the fact that people already live there and live there ourselves. Regardless of the politics in its origin, the fact of the matter is, 80 years later, we have two states with millions of people living in them. And it's not just enough to understand the ideology, but how do you find a livable, workable solution for millions of people? That is the answer that should be sought now. All right. Switching gears to Russia. Oh, Russia. Oh, they're such a mess. I've been reading up on Russia. I've been trying to listen to podcasts. I've been trying to bolster up my knowledge, and it's just a mess. All right, so Russia is still solidly absolutist monarch, right? Like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Nicholas the First, Nicholas the Second, like there's no difference here. Everything is still basically exactly the same. It's autocracy, it's nationalism, and it's orthodoxy, right? Like it's the church, it's the crown, and like this idea of sacred autocracy is still set in stone so squarely. Like Nicholas II so firmly believed in it. So a few things to know about Tsar Nicholas II. First of all, he never wanted to be Tsar. He never thought he was going to be Tsar. He ended up as Tsar because his older brother died. He was a very passive family man. He was not someone cut out for leadership, especially during this time. He didn't have the brains for it, frankly. He didn't have the will for it, and he wasn't trained up for it. So, keeping in mind, you had Alexander the First, right, who was the big reformer. Then he frees the serfs, and then he's killed. So then you have Nicholas the First, who is very much anti-reform, anti any sort of liberal agenda, right? Autocracy, autocracy, autocracy. Then you have Alexander II, who's kind of the same way. So enter Nicholas II, right? He has been living this life all of his life. Like the Romanovs have been ruling for 400 years now. And he so firmly believes in this sacred autocracy. The problem with Nicholas II is the fact that, gosh, I think he sounds like a really good dad. And I'm like, a good husband, but a terrible czar. So his wife, Elizabeth, is actually a German princess. And she was not popular with the Russian public at all. And she didn't really try to be. She was super religious. And the problem was she got all of her answers from Rasputin. You probably know Rasputin just from, I don't know, Disney movies, or just he's a commonly known figure. So Rasputin is a holy man, holy, quotation marks around the word holy, who claimed to be able to cure their son's hemophilia. Frankly, he was a nymphomaniac and a fraud. He was from Siberia, showed up having claimed to do these miracles, and since Elizabeth was desperate for an answer, desperate for a cure for Alexei's hemophilia, she was willing to hear from him. And weirdly enough, although Rasputin was a drunk, a liar, all intents and purposes a fraud, Alexei did seem to get better when he was around. Now, maybe it was just like placebo effect, like who knows? Coincidence? But this was enough to like verify to the Tsarina that like this was a holy man. And it just pissed people off, right? Like we're in war. It's just so bad. So eventually, some of the Russian nobility are like, we need to like save the Tsar from this fraud. So they are going to decide to kill him. So they invite him over so he can essentially like sleep with one of their wives because he like slept with everyone. They poison him with a bottle of wine. Supposedly like one glass of wine would have been enough to kill him. He drinks the entire bottle and is still kicking. So they like panic and they get out a gun and they shoot him multiple times. And he's like, "You shot me," and runs away. Again, he's still fine. Like, who knows if it's just adrenaline or what. They shoot him some more. He comes at them. They shoot him again and then dump him in the river and he drowns. Right? That's his cause of death, is drowning. Not the poison, not the multiple gunshot wounds. Oh, Rasputin. So Nicholas believes it's his duty to uphold autocracy, and he did not believe that he could let his grip on this autocracy, on this absolutism, even slip a little bit. So he could not even consider changing Russia to a constitutional monarchy because he would be letting down all of his ancestors. He's poorly advised from the start. He's surrounded by sycophants. And as our cities grow, and remember, we don't have very many big cities in Russia, there is more and more working class unrest. So in the 19th century, we see growing discontent with traditional forms of government, leading to the development of new political ideas, socialism, Marxism. The fact of the matter is the emancipation of serfs did not lead to economic success in agriculture. It did not lead to improvement of serfs' lives. The Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War unleashed massive protests. It's embarrassing. We see massive political unrest, terrorism, worker strikes, assassinations, peasant riots, military mutinies. And in 1905, you have our first Russian Revolution, Bloody Sunday, where you see peaceful protesters in Moscow being brutally cut down by the Tsar's military. So, in response, we have an attempt for a little bit of reform, right? The Duma, the national parliament, is created to try and appeal to liberal demands, and you have the Stolpen reforms. They are going to be in existence from 1906 to 1917. And under the Stolpen reforms, peasants will be granted greater freedom from redemption payments and could buy and sell land more freely. There is going to be more attempts at education, and all of these reforms utterly fail, just like the Russian army did at war. The Russian army is literally the largest army in the world, but it was so badly managed. It had incompetent generals, insufficient supplies, poorly trained soldiers, and poor communication. They were prepared for a 6-month war, not a 4-year-long war of attrition. And as the nature of warfare changed, other countries could adapt, but Russia could not, right? Russia's rigid czarist system worked one way, as it had worked for 400 years, and it could not adapt to the fact that now we have rapid transportation, now we have chemical weapons, now we need to change our warfare. Russia couldn't adapt. Leadership was from noble families, and they were in complete denial about the nature of the war, right? They were more worried about losing favor with Nicholas II than the fact that millions of their soldiers were dying. You had poor military intelligence, spying, so the enemy knew what the Russians were doing all the time, but the Russian army never knew what the enemy was doing. Plus, the limited infrastructure in Russia, the lack of telegraph lines, railroads, meant you didn't have communications between armies. You didn't have movement of troops. They lost so many battles. They ran out of ammunition, so they were ordered into battle without weapons. Grab guns from your dead comrades, guys, like obviously. You have stupid mistakes about not thinking about how to properly equip the army. Like they didn't have winter boots because they thought, hey, this war's going to be over before winter gets here, so we don't need to build up a lot of winter boots and coats for our soldiers. And there was only one factory in all of Russia that could make the winter boots, but to make these boots, they needed a chemical which they would buy from Germany. And they didn't think to stockpile this chemical before the war. In fact, they didn't stockpile any supplies at all. So, home front in the war, you have railroads broken down, crops rotting in fields, civilians are starving in cities. Peasants honestly never had it better because they didn't have to send their crops away, and frankly, they weren't able to, so they ate so well. In cities, however, food and fuel was scarce. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas is living the high life. Caviar, champagne. He's not feeling an inch of this war. And he didn't appear to care. So, in 1917, food runs out in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, in March and February. So, women, once again, think like French Revolution, women are going to stage massive demonstrations. And when they send the soldiers out to put these demonstrators down again, the soldiers join them, right? They mutiny. They're not getting paid. They're not getting fed. It's their wives and children who are starving. No, why am I going to side with you, Tsar? What have you done for me? So when you lose the military, you've lost your chance. So Tsar Nicholas II abdicates and a provisional government is formed. Enter the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were a radical Marxist political party founded by Vladimir Lenin in 1903, and they seized power in November of 1917 during our second wave of the Russian Revolution. Leon Trotsky is also going to be a leader in this group as well. So the Bolsheviks are one of many sort of socialist Marxist groups in Russia. You have a lot of these radical groups, and they're talking and they're planning, and it's going to be, the Bolsheviks will be one of the groups that come out of this. They'll end up winning the day. They don't kill Tsar Nicholas at first. They are worried about the international response. They're busy just dealing with the war, right? So they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and I might have gotten that wrong, and pull out of the war. So they're holding the Tsar and his family as hostages, right? Potential bargaining chips. Eventually, though, it becomes clear that they're more of a liability than an asset, and so they are murdered. They are kept in a home in sort of the Ural Mountains, and one day, one of the soldiers goes upstairs to the family and says, like, we need to move you to safety. There's like a civil war happening in Russia, and these like armies are getting close. Like, we need to move you down to the basement. So they move down to the basement. The Tsar Nicholas, the Tsarina, the three princesses, the heir Alexei, a female servant, and like a male doctor, right? Because Alexei has hemophilia. So they are there. But the Tsarina is like, we don't even get chairs to sit on. And so they're like, bring a couple chairs. So they get a chair for Alexei and for the Tsarina. And the soldier is like, all right, we need you to line up for a picture to show that like you're alive. And so they all line up. And then the soldier pulls out a piece of paper and says, like, by order of the provisional government, you have been found guilty against crimes against the state and have been ordered to be executed. Poor Nicholas II, right? All he ever really wanted was to not let his family down. His wife, his children, he loved his children. He didn't have the shoulders to bear the weight of Russian autocracy. So he hears this proclamation and says, what? Wait, what? And is shot. They just open fire on this family. At first, the bullets seem to be ricocheting off the daughters, and so they flee to the corner of the room, and soldiers, enraged, go for it and end up shooting them in the head. Turns out, on all of their corsets, they had sewed in jewels, so it sort of acted as armor, right? So they wouldn't be completely broke. The bodies are disfigured. They are burned and have acid poured on them. It's terrible. It's just utterly terrible. So, I mean, for all of the failures of Tsar Nicholas as a leader, he didn't deserve to be murdered like that, nor did his children. So let's talk about Marxism and Leninism. So Vladimir Lenin is going to be the leader of the Bolshevik, later Communist Party. He's an interesting guy. He's born into a middle-class family, and he's well-educated, and his father will die when he's relatively young, like he's a teenager. But more significantly, his older brother will die. So his older brother was like his idol. And his older brother will get involved with a plot to kill the Tsar. And not just like, I want to kill the president, I want to kill the Tsar kind of thing. But like he actually planned it out. Like he made bombs. He had bombs on his person. So when his older brother is executed, he is going to become radical. He will eventually be exiled until 1917. First, he'll be exiled in Siberia, then later in Switzerland. He will devote his attention to organizing followers, and he wanted to create a party that would lead a revolution, not wait for it. Right? He didn't necessarily have a lot of respect for the poor peasant. He didn't believe that they would be able to do this for himself. So, the German government actually lets Lenin back into Russia, hoping he would destabilize it. And he did. Yeah, he was pretty successful in that effort. So Lenin's ideas. Lenin introduced alterations to Marxist theory to make it work for Russia, right? So Marx says that the workers, the proletariat, will unite against the bourgeoisie, right? You have this struggle that has been going on for centuries. The problem is that Russia isn't industrialized enough to actually have a proletariat. Instead, they have millions of peasants, and the industrial proletariat is a minority of Russia. So Lenin claims that you can have a proletarian revolution without a proletariat. Marx says that you'll be able to self-emancipate, right? It must be the workers must unite and free themselves. Lenin says, no. Revolutionaries can seize power on behalf of the working class. So this means Russia does not actually need a universal peasant revolt. Lenin's ideas are introduced to a group of Russian Marxists called the Bolsheviks, which means majority. And after they take power, you have an immediate peace. All the power to the Soviets, meaning councils, and transfers of land to the peasants and factories to the workers, right? You take all of the wealth, the private property, from the bourgeoisie. This is very popular among the exhausted soldiers and workers who just want to go home. Private property would not be protected. The government should control the resources to ensure equity among the citizens. In Russia, this is particularly appealing to many ex-serfs who have little or no individual resources. The problem is we are going to see that corruption is so rampant that it's going to be the Bolshevik higher-ups who actually have all the private property now. So you have the February and the October revolutions, the two parts to our revolution. So the February Revolution is actually happening in March because the Orthodox calendar is different from the Gregorian calendar, which we use here in the West. You have the women staging protests, the soldiers mutiny. See you later, Tsar Nicholas. Done. The result is going to be an internal power struggle between the provisional government and the various revolutionary factions in Petrograd. So the Russian generals order another offensive against the Germans, and the soldiers just refuse. Soldiers desert the army by hundreds of thousands, and the Germans advance. So in the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government and arrest all the other revolutionary groups. They seize control of Petrograd, and Russia is in chaos. They nationalize all private property, order the peasants to hand over their crops with no compensation. So this is, worse. And The peasants, having captured the estates of the nobles, the boyars, refused. They're like, no, I'm not doing this. The Bolsheviks take control of factories. They draft all the workers into compulsory labor brigades. Lenin uses the Cheka, the secret police, to enforce his orders and execute his enemies. So first things first, they got to end their involvement in World War I. So in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, you have peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary. They lose a lot of territory that contains a third of Russia's population and wealth. So you can see on the map here, they lose Poland, Romania, Ukraine, basically Finland, Estonia, Latvia. These states will become independent republics. In Central Asia and the Caucasus region, the Russian colonies will just break away. They sense an opportunity for self-rule and they take it. So the collapse of the Russian Empire under the stress of World War I enabled this self-determination. And it is out of this chaos that you will have a civil war in Russia. And eventually you will have the emergence of the Soviet Union. So, for your summary, who are the Bolsheviks? How do Lenin's ideas differ from Marx's? And what led to revolution in Russia? Thanks, guys. As always, you can find all of our lectures here on our YouTube playlist. You can find lots of other videos telling you more about Russia. Gosh, this is a highly studied subject and it's super fascinating. So I would encourage you to check out other videos. And I think that's it. Keep on listening for more lectures from AP World History Unit 7. Thank you.